All right, YouTube, it's time to talk about the concept of Gnosis, sort of the Gnostic philosophy, and some of the takeoffs of Gnostic philosophy, some of the inclusions also within other mystical paths that have to do with Gnosis. I don't think people who study Gnosis often are not aware their reach went beyond simply the Gnostic movement as sort of a middling to small group in antiquity that gets, of course, oppressed by the Christians, begins to die out, and we know very little of them except from some of the sort of philosophical and religious writings of the time. Now, Gnosticism itself dates to the same sort of period, early Christianity, early days of that same original proto-church, you could call it. Essentially, at the time, the church consisted of buildings in which Christians happened to gather. It wasn't what people would recognize today as a church, where you've got sort of dedicated priests or pastors or something that dispense the holy power of their deity. To that period, you then have these groups, the Gnostics, the Arians, or whatever, that treat the Christian God or Christian symbolism differently than what became the mainstream Christians, the Orthodoxy, and then, of course, the Catholic Church thereafter, after sort of that original central tradition forms, and the Gnostics, of course, get beat on for centuries and go underground, which makes sense. They were being, crucified and burned alive and thrown into the animal pits and so forth. The idea of Gnosis is that there is a sort of undivided divine totality. It gets a little bit confusing for those who haven't, I think, studied like quantum mathematics or something like that, the concept of infinity, who haven't really ruminated on that for a while. It's probably more confusing. You could mathematically express it as this divine totality is both everything and nothing. It is infinitely everything and also negative infinity. You could sort of classify it that way. Look at it as one total dimension above which and below which other dimensions, in a way, in the philosophical sense, cease to have any real meaning. And they call this force Sophia, or at least the personification of this force. It's sort of a goddess. I believe that specific figure is also treated from and sort of taken off from older sort of goddess figures of similar archetype. But the idea is that there is a cosmic divine whole that's unadulterated, incorruptible. It is the purest light and the purest darkness. It is both everything and nothing at the same time. To the eyes of, if you're living in the tangible world, you would regard it that way anyway. It sort of defies description. Even when you begin to describe it, you've sort of destroyed that central Gnostic principle in your own mind by attempting to give it labels. It gets rather confusing. There are various sort of Archon forces. You think of Abraxas. Abraxas is the god, which is sort of a Herculean figure of sorts, with a shield and a whip or sword of some sort, legs that look like fishtails, and the head of a rooster. It's a rather strange symbolism involved with this specific sort of symbol itself. I always thought that this figure looked this sort of liberating figure almost within Gnosticism looks superficially like Enki or Dagon, or some of these other sort of horned, sometimes aquatic and fish-tailed deity figures from around the world. I thought that was funny. There's a Father Kresge's collection down in Ecuador, which most of it's gone missing. He claimed to be in possession of a great many relics that show some sort of now no longer extant culture that was living in the area around the time. It ties into the inner earth sort of stuff, and some of it may be hoax, but some of the extant materials that were unearthed there appear to exhibit this same strange figure that keeps popping up around these different cultures, from Sumeria through the Gnostics over into the Americas, of these figures they have strange animalistic features. They have legs like fishtails or whatever. Enki, of course, has one. Abraxas has two. Both legs are fishtails. I find that this has nothing to do with Gnosis so much as it's an interesting synchronicity between this sort of symbolism and some of these other groups. I believe they all tie together based on my understanding of man's history. That's just my opinion, perhaps an educated opinion, but just my opinion anyway. And then you have, of course, the Demiurge. Now, you have the concept within Gnosis that what the Christians call God is actually not only a fairly lowly figure, but a corrupting and perhaps evil one. Not necessarily evil in the objective absolute sense, but as in corrupted and degraded from that original cosmic whole. You have essentially the idea that out of selfishness or lunacy, this creator figure creates a world in which things are broken apart, fractured reality. That is, that in the divine reality, according to Gnosis, there shouldn't be any partitioning between discrete parts. There shouldn't be dichotomies. There shouldn't be male and female. There shouldn't be up and down. There shouldn't be left and right. There shouldn't be light and darkness. There shouldn't be any of these things. And the best way to, and they would also consider, by the way, the Christian heaven, they would consider a sort of purgatorial hell-like place, actually a place of suffering. And the best way to liken it is this. According to the Gnostics, the different hierarchies, the different layers of reality, you've got the divine cosmic total at the top. And of course, at some future date, they say, oh, well, everything will eventually return to that divine total. It's a little bit like the sort of concept of nirvana within Buddhism, actually, or a little bit like becoming a deity through many reincarnations within Vedic lore. Anyways, at the top is this sort of total divine light. You think of it as rays of the purest light. The Demiurge creates a veil underneath this and sets up the heavens below it. And then the mundane, the little people, the tangible creations, which he then fractured off of this divine total to make into tangible forms to rule over them because of selfishness or lunacy. They look up at the heaven that was created by the Demiurge, and they see a place of light. In reality, it's a place of relative darkness because it's still a veiled, shadowy place when compared to the highlight of that sort of cosmic singularity. That is, the Demiurge veils that cosmic light from the eyes of what he considers to be his creation. Satan is considered the good guy of this sort of duality, fighting against the power of this Demiurge in a way, I guess. Although not really, again, just as the Demiurge is not necessarily bad in an objective sense, just confused or a lunatic or something. And fated to eventually lose all power and suffer greatly as the result. So Satan is not, I suppose, objectively good so much as subjectively good, serves a purpose within this sort of fractured totality that's been created, the fallen, degraded existence, to fight against that same force that has degraded it in the first place. The idea is that this being that creates the physical reality, what we would consider the mundane reality, the lower realm below even the heaven that he created, cannot be governed properly and necessarily spawned opposition to his own rulership, specifically because it was fractured, specifically because dichotomy began to exist. For every action there is then the reaction within this fallen realm. That is, the Demiurge figured, well, I'll create this place I can rule over and I can do whatever the hell I want and I can be as evil as I want or as benevolent as I want. Unfortunately, when that being does this, it gives rise automatically to everything opposite his own force. That is, for the masculine, there is generated the feminine. For obedience, there is generated rebellion, and so forth. I would like to point out a simple concept that is, I guess, vaguely Gnostic. If you take a lump of clay and you create a vase out of it, you have created a vase, but you've also destroyed the lump of clay it came from. Even the concept of entropy within this system doesn't actually exist. What we observe as entropy would be described as simply change. It takes the form, for our eyes, to our eyes, it takes the form of entropy. In reality, the only gauge upon which we judge what entropy actually means is by observing whether it works for man, whether it's organized to our eyes, whether it appears to be what we recognize as organization. This is actually a very true concept. Again, if you take something which you consider useless and disorganized and rearrange it, you haven't actually increased its order, so to speak. You have simply changed its order around. Entropy is an illusion within such a system, and what people would regard as good is actually either neutral or evil. What they regard as evil is neutral or good. There is no actual creation or destruction. Even the concept of the fallen chunk of totality as being a sort of place of suffering, where materialism and physicality are suffering, isn't objectively bad on the principle that eventually it does go away because the Demiurge lacks the capability to infinitely and perpetually control it. Likewise, all of the other forces that fight against that same power also go away. They simply negate one another. It's essentially, if you thought about the concept of what if there was some sort of matter that instead of having protons and electrons sort of opposing one another to create a tangible form of matter, you had simply something that was the total thereof, something utterly neutral that didn't react, didn't move, didn't even really exist. You call it quantum or something. That would essentially be what you're talking about here. You have a divine undivided total. There is no dichotomy. There, you would think of, trying to think of the term within theosophy, but also spoken of within Eastern lore. They have a similar term, actually, for this very principle. And it's escaping me at the moment. I'll have to read Steiner's work again to remember action. Devachan. Devachan is what it's called. Sort of this place beyond life and beyond sort of immediate death. You're going to a sort of dreamlike state, after which the true ascension happens. To them, I suppose, if you were to liken that to Gnostic thought, you're going through the sort of corrupted heaven, and then you're finally ascending to the divine total. They would perhaps liken it not to the lunatic urges of some evil god, but as to a natural process or a fallen state that was nonetheless deemed appropriate to purify itself, to purify things which came into existence, which became conscious, which were able to make, they had volition, they were capable of making decisions. You have this same basic principle in many of these systems. What they disagree upon is the state of the creator and whether it's good, evil, or neutral, or fallen, or chaotic, or lawful, and orderly. Satan, does it exist at all? If so, what is its nature? Or the nature of any other counterpart to some supposedly divine creator. The basic concept, though, is simply that the creator that is regarded as God by the Christians can actually possibly be the highest God, because this creator does not have all power. And you can prove that very simply, because when you look at this creator's nature, there are things that it pledges itself not to do. It is also discrete. It has volition. It exists in at least a temporarily tangible state. It has a will of its own. Therefore, if it exists at all, it can't truly be all-powerful, because there are some things it pledges not to do. It can't be all-present. It focuses on one place at a time, perhaps. It also appears in the Bible, in the Christian's own canon, not to be all-knowing. It has to ask certain questions, like how did you know that you were naked? What happened to your brother? Or something that you find in Genesis. You could chalk them up to rhetorical questions. The other possibility is, of course, the being didn't actually know. The Gnostics would look at this and say, well, yeah, that's because it's just the Demiurge. It's not this total undivided force that exists far, far beyond the meager creation that it itself existed. It's simply a part of its own creation. It is one corrupted element that gained volition through some means, lunacy, evil, selfishness, just experimenting for experimentation's sake. I've spoken to some. There was a cult briefly called believe it or not, called the Cult of Her Black Cunt. And they were essentially neo-Gnostics, if you can give them such a term, except that they venerated Lilith rather than this Sophia. They took the opposite side. Instead of the divine whole being light and enjoyment and anti-materialism for an enlightened sake, it was a primordial chaos in which there were bubbles of temporary order arose in bubbles within this sort of chaotic soup, which was considered to them, I guess, relaxing. This was the place to be. This state was the proper one to be in, and these bubbles were controlled by Lilith. I guess that's just the term they're giving to this primordial entity. That is, you have these little punctuated points of order or disorder within the chaos. These little dichotomous situations. But then there was but then the Christian God comes along. I can't remember exactly how their manuscript described that. I believe was sort of a spawn of Lilith that became corrupted, sort of addicted to, wondering about these little punctuated points. Actually managed to penetrate one of them and created, sort of prolapsed it inside out and created an entire universe. And that this was seen as very evil. Satan is not regarded as anything. The ultimate goal is to return to this essentially Babylonian whore figure, which is Lilith within this sort of cult manuscript. And the idea is to return to that primordial chaos. But you can tell it's Gnostically inspired. It appears to be slightly Lovecraft inspired, so I'm not sure if this is meant to be taken literally. I may or may not actually still have the manuscript from that. I think it's backed up on the old computer maybe. But it's interesting anyway. These things should be pondered. This is a philosophical statement from antiquity. And at least some of these Gnostic principles do make sense, and possibly they're true. You could think of some sort of, not necessarily divine, but some sort of total infinite whole, which did, for some mathematical or scientific or divine reason, did get corrupted by some sort of force or, principle, and fell into a lower state, and that all of existence eventually returns there somehow, or maybe it keeps falling. Maybe things get worse from here. I haven't heard of many religious groups that regard the possibility that everybody suffers after they die, and that they suffer yet more in each incarnation until they finally dissolve into pure pain and agony and become like absolutely blistered, fucked up demons or something like that. I'm sure nobody would want such a religion. Nobody would follow it because they'd be terrified by it. But hey, that's just as much a possibility as the counterpart. Most religions teach that over time, and Christianity and Islam are actually opposed to this for the most part, at least in some of their forms. Most of them believe that everyone eventually sort of gets there to a varying degree. Even in some of the Christian groups, nobody suffers forever. Eventually all people go to some level of paradise, just some people get it better than others. But what if the opposite is true? What if everyone goes to hell and some people just suffer less than others and they stay there forever, or maybe after 1,000,000 years they die again and they go to an even lower hell level that's even more monstrous and horrific, and there's nothing they can do about it? I think that'd be funny. Never-ending dissension. That could become a religion unto itself. Someone else should experiment with that philosophy as well. But Gnosis is interesting. I'm not a Gnostic, obviously. I don't believe in the Christian God as existing at all. I think that one problem with Gnosis is that because those creating this sort of philosophy were preeminently being exposed to Christian teachings, these early Christian writings, Jewish writings, some of the Roman sort of cults, the general religions of antiquity, that's the philosophy that they drew off of. So all the figures there are sort of Christianized vaguely. Now, they've got the same deity, they just relegate it to fallen status. They've got sort of the the Roman cult goddess. They've simply given it a different name and characteristics and power level, so to speak. They've got the same philosophical principles from that sort of Greco-Roman antiquity in that early period where it begins merging with Christianity and Judaism. Had this arisen somewhere else, in the Far East, among some Buddhists, or in some shamanist tribe in the Americas or something, the philosophy would have been at least vaguely different. And that's something that, again, one of the reasons some people have wondered, well, why do you keep changing your belief system and using these labels? I'm like, well, no, I can't really use a label anymore. I'm an occultist. I do practice, mystic arts. I'm a pagan insofar as I think the pagan gods are way better than, Jesus Christ or Muhammad or something like that. But studying all of these paths, I think a person can't really do anything with spirituality unless they have a very, very wide breadth of study in every form of spirituality they can get their hands on, and then some, even things that are not outright religious themselves, which is exactly why I do so. So that's a little bit about Gnosis. I haven't delved too deeply into it. I've read the Hypostasis, I've read the Chaldean Oracles, I've read there are a few sources that are new, actually, because there are still Gnostics on this planet. I've even thought about writing my own sort of little treatise on some of these Gnostic principles, specifically those that I agree with, or those that I adapt from it. I'm thinking of doing so, because that's of interest. It's a spiritual path that a lot of people have never even heard of them, and those that have, most of them have heard of very little about it. They haven't really studied the Gnostic writings themselves, so they have opinions of Gnosticism that don't necessarily equate to materials like the hypostasis of the Archons. So, people should study it, definitely. It's interesting, if nothing else. That's about all. Peace out.